I always like to start in the language of my ancestors, the Ojibwe language, the Anishinaabe language, to pay homage to what the elders taught us, to introduce ourselves in our traditional fashion. So I tell you that my names are Wabanakwit, Kwekwe Kibena, Sozal Bitung, and Kinew. For the sake of the cover space, it's been shortened to Wab. Happened long ago once I left the reserve. I also say that I'm a member of the Lynx clan. That's my family, is the Lynx. And I come from a place on earth called Kakagiwa Tesoniga Ming. Raven's Nest Portage would be the literal translation of my community. But I'll show you a spot not too far away. It's a very beautiful place to grow up. It's a very beautiful place to be a child. And this actual spot is called Niangashing. Niangashing. It means sand point in our language. And then I pay homage to the Okanagan Nation for hosting me here and hosting all of us here tonight. And I'm here to share a story, not to tell them how they should do things in their own backyard, but rather just to share a few things that I've seen on my journey, and the hopes that there might be something there to meditate on. And then finally, I also acknowledge the spiritual society of the Metewin and also the Sundance that I'm a part of. And I come before you very humble, very honored to be the son of Tabasanakwit and Kathy Avery Kinew, and even more honored to be the father of Bejigo Miigwan and Oshki Anan. And so that is how we say good evening in the Ojibwe language. When these Anishinaabe were growing up in this place on earth, they're joyous, happy, industrious people. And yet there was something that must have haunted them. Father talked about there being this persistent fear as a childhood, and he didn't know what it was. Then all of a sudden, one day, the fear materialized. And a black robe arrived to take the children away. And he was put in St. Mary's Residential School. And on his first day at St. Mary's, this is a photo of him with his grandfather, Kakagiwanikwip, Everlasting Feather. The old man stopped in one day to check on his grandson and to see how he was doing. But what had happened to this little boy on his first day of arriving at the residential school is that he was told that your name is not Tabasanakwit, as you have known all your life. You have a number 54. And when we shout that number, you will jump to attention. And you also have a different name. It's Peter Kelly. Of course, none of this he understood because he didn't speak the English language. Over the course of the next number of years, he experienced the horror stories, which we sometimes hear. I'll spare you some of the details right now, but I'll just share one anecdote that he shared with me. He said that he had this little buddy at St. Mary's when he was about this age, maybe around 9 or 10. This other little boy's name was Migons. That was his traditional name, but he was renamed Louis in the residential school. Migons was orphaned in the residential school because his father passed away, and then his mother, who suffered from inconsolable grief, left him there. So this little boy stayed in the residential school year-round. They had beds right beside one another, at the foot of which there was a box. And in that box were housed all of their worldly possessions, all their toys, all their clothes. There's a divider in the middle. Tabasanakwit's on one side, Migons is on the other side. So one day they were playing outside beside a pile of gravel with their little trucks, cars. And suddenly a non-native man in a suit approached the boys. When this man approached, Migons looked at the ground, suddenly very timid. So Migoons left with him. After they walked away, my father ran around up the other side of the hill to get a good vantage point and see what was going on. Finally, he got there and he looked down the hill and he could see a circle of men standing around, passing around a flask and smoking cigarettes. There's a pile of clothes in the middle of that circle. Suddenly, the pile of clothes moved. And my late father, Ndete Iban, recognized that was his friend Migos. And then, just then, one of the men picked him up and gave him an uppercut in the stomach, and the boy collapsed again to the ground. That was all that Tabasanakut saw. He ran back to the residential school, tried to tell one of the priest fathers, but was unsuccessful. A few days later, another one of the priests, one who was friendly to the children and who spoke our language well, came to my father and said, Migons kinonde waba mig, akozi wiga migon. So your buddy Migons is in the hospital and he wants to see you. So he drove Tabasanakut to the hospital, and there was Migons in a gown. And through the gown, he could see an incision running from his belly button to his sternum. So they're talking there, and Migons told my father, he said, I want you to take all my things. I want you to take everything from my side and put it on your side. Take my little comic books and cars and trucks and my clothes and stuff like that. So Tabasanakut said, okay, I'll do that. So we went back to the school and moved everything to his side of the box. A few days later, nurse came in, said, Peter, take that mattress that Louis was using, take it outside and pour this powder on it. And Ndete Iban tried to ask, well, what happened to Louis? She said, he won't be coming back. My father didn't speak English well enough at the time. He didn't know the word die. So he said, Ki ni bo na, in Ojibwe. Did he die? Of course, the nurse didn't know what he was talking about. The priests, after the fact, insisted that Louis died of tuberculosis. But Tabasanakut always insisted that it was the beating that the boy received that killed him. And of course, if you're familiar with that sort of trauma, the boy probably would have coughed up blood and may have appeared to share some of the symptoms of TB. But it was stories like that that stayed with my old man through the years. You know? Why do we say residential school survivor? Because Migons died in the residential school and Tabasanakut survived it. That's why we use that term. So the residential school story haunted us for many years. When I was growing up, I didn't feel close to my father at all. Matter of fact, I hated him for many years, right? I resented his presence. But something that had frozen long ago all of a sudden began to thaw. And it began to thaw because of the courage of residential school survivors like Phil Fontaine, Bobby Joseph, Carolyn Briere, and thousands of others across this country who, starting in the 90s, began to stand up and tell their stories. Then in the early 2000s, began to demand justice of this country and launch class action lawsuits, right? Like the narrative that we have now is like, well, you know, the residential school thing happened and the country was outraged, so then the Prime Minister came and apologized, right? It's not really what happened. Right? Like a more complete account of what happened was residential school survivors stood up and demanded justice. They launched a suite of class action lawsuits which would have bankrupted all 5 churches and put a big dent in government coffers to the tune of about $80 billion. And though they could have pursued that in open court, they decided to say, no, we don't want to seek retribution. We'll settle for $5 billion in compensation, the apology. But since we're not going to have our day in court, we want a truth commission. It's a remarkable story, and it's a remarkable sign of the benevolence that generation in our community was willing to extend to the rest of the country, to not fight tooth and nail and carry that process out for years. And so as this was happening in the national scene, the national public sphere was being, overtaken with a discourse on reconciliation. All of a sudden, in our home, that conversation became opened again. When I was a boy and I used to hear stories like the time my paternal grandfather was buried at the foot of the residential school, I used to wonder, why would they bury my dad's dad at his school? I didn't understand. And I think that's a fairly common story amongst people of my generation. We didn't really understand what had happened to those who came before us, right? But now with the compensation agreement and the apology and the launch of the TRC, all of a sudden we started to gain a better appreciation for what had happened before. And it was actually when Bobby Joseph spoke in Winnipeg in 2010 that I finally understood, or actually no, I think it was 2010, that I finally understood what was going on between my father and I. Bobby Joseph, that time he got up, he said, to us, as the sons, as the daughters of residential school survivors, he told us, we've always loved you. We just didn't know how to show you. Right? So at the time I was a journalist working for CBC News, and around the launch of the TRC, I did a documentary on my father's experience. And so this scene is from that documentary. And my father is telling his grandson, my son, Oshkianung, he's telling him at the site of his former residential school, yes, there were little boys there just like you. Right? So it was this weird moment where we were having this tenderness and this openness, and he recounted some of his most painful stories, and we actually hugged one another in an open moment of emotional honesty for the first time in our lives. And it all happened in front of a national television audience. Right? And I think that kind of captures what this experience of reconciliation has been like for many people in our community. That the personal is indelibly intertwined with the national level conversation. Right? So as we became closer, the two generations in our family, that broader reconciliation discussion in this country could take place. And as that broader discussion took place, it created openings for people in our families to start having the conversations and putting things back together and making things right. It's a real interesting interplay between the micro and macro level. And so we are in this period of reconciliation. Right? This province has a ministry of Aboriginal relations and reconciliation. This year we heard the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's, at least the executive summary of their work. And it's a remarkable document. I encourage everyone here to read it. Not least of all because it's free. Download the PDF. But what's really remarkable about the work that the Truth Commission did is that they drew a straight line between the earliest days of colonization through the residential school era and the continuing legacies today. And they said the one thing that unites all those is the continued existence of a myth of cultural superiority with respect to Indigenous peoples. That's the attitude, that myth that justified the doctrine of discovery 500 years ago that said that non-Catholics couldn't own their own land and therefore it was okay to dispossess them. Right? It was the same myth of cultural superiority that led to the creation of the residential schools. And that myth still continues to underpin too much of what happens in the public sphere today. For instance, in the child welfare system, what the TRC report says is that too many child welfare agencies continue to view Aboriginal poverty as a symptom of parental neglect rather than as a result of failed past government policies. It's a fairly devastating critique. And the term cultural genocide, too. Right? The usage of the term cultural genocide, I think it speaks to the perspicacity, to the intelligence of Murray Sinclair. Because the TRC, in their terms of reference, they're prevented from making legal findings of fact. And the word genocide has a legal definition at the international level because there is a convention on the prevention of genocide. Article 2 of said convention, removing the children of one group, placing them with another group for the purposes of destroying that first group's culture and language is genocide. But they're prevented from doing so by the terms of reference of the TRC, right? So what did Murray do? He said, well, nothing preventing us from saying cultural genocide, because that term has no legal definition, right? And I know that that term is painful to hear. Believe me, I know. How do you think we feel? You know? It's not like we're getting some sort of sick, perverse pleasure, like saying, oh, Canada, you're guilty of cultural genocide. No. It's because that's the term that accurately defines what happened in this era. All right? Incidentally, I was in the room when this photo was taken and when they tabled the report, and it was electric. It was so powerful to be there, right? And like standing ovation after standing ovation. It was amazing. The people were like, finally, the truth is being told. In 2012, my father received a terminal diagnosis of cancer. Right? It was a very aggressive pancreatic cancer. So my sister, younger sister Shawan, she's overseas, Harvard University, doing her field work in Italy. You know, it's very bright. We're talking to one another, trying to figure out what's going on, because, you know, my dad's part of that old school, right? Like the Stoic generation. Doesn't want to cultivate pity or sympathy for himself. So we're trying to figure it out, and we're like, yeah, it's pretty serious. So we're talking to one another, and we're thinking, what should we do? We asked each other a series of questions. Are you going to care if you don't work at CBC this summer? 10 years from now? 20 years from now? Will you look back and regret not working at CBC this summer? How about you? A generation from now, 2 generations from now, will you regret not finishing your PhD on time? Or will you regret not making things right with the old man before he left this earth? When you think about it like that, there's really no decision to be made. It's a completely obvious choice. And so we resolved to spend the time to make things right, to fix that which had been broken apart so many years before. So next day I went in and I took an unpaid leave. And she was on a plane back from Italy soon after. And we spent that year cooking for him, cleaning for him, driving him to chemotherapy. Right? And full credit to him, he didn't recoil, he didn't back away, he stayed there with us. And we built the relationship. You know, we rebuilt what had been damaged. But he also took us on a remarkable journey. He took us on a very remarkable journey that year. The journey began with this meeting in 2009 at the Vatican. You know, this happened after the apology. People have been critical of this meeting because Pope Benedict, who you see there, he didn't apologize. He didn't say, I'm sorry. Right? So even in the TRC report, they criticized this, and they said that the Vatican should issue a real apology. I asked my father about this. I said, what did you think? You were there. And he said, yeah, I was wondering on the plane ride over, why are we going? What's going to happen? You know? Said, so I thought to myself, I'm going to offer the Pope the eagle feather and see what he does. And then I'll know whether he's serious about reconciliation or not. Because if I give him the eagle feather and he doesn't accept it, then I'll know that nothing he says has meaning. However, if I offer him the eagle feather, knowing that everywhere in the world they know that the eagle feather is a symbol of North American Indigenous spirituality, if I offer him that feather and he accepts it, then I will know that things have changed. It's moments like this where you recognize that the impossible can become possible. Because earlier in my father's life, this picture was an impossibility. Right? But now things have changed. But also on this trip to the Vatican, my father met the Archbishop of Winnipeg, James Weisgerber. And so they developed a friendship. And started going out for lunch and doing whatever it is that old men do when they're hanging out. I really have no idea. So in 2012, my father tells me in April of that year, I'm going to adopt the Archbishop as my brother. What do you think? And I was like, all of a sudden I had a scratch and itch that wasn't there. I was like, yeah, okay. In my head I was thinking, how are people going to perceive this? Is this going to be viewed in our community as another instance of the First Nations person bending over backwards to accommodate the non-native person who does little in return? People are going to look at this like a sellout move? Oh, Wabanakut. Such a young person's way of looking at the scenario. So I'm, contemplating these things. Got like a little thought bubble going on above my head here. And I was like, well, I guess it doesn't really matter, An old man can do what he wants. He can be the one to do the ceremony, and I'll just stand on the sidelines and keep my thoughts to myself. And my father interrupted my little internal soliloquy and said, and that's why I want you to conduct the adoption ceremony. I was like, all right, well, so much for standing on the sidelines then. All right. We did it, 2012, he embraced the black robe. The descendant of the black robe who had taken him from his family, he now embraced another black robe as his kin. And in our ceremonial way of life, it's a healing ceremony. It's a peacemaking ceremony. We may have had conflict, but now I take you as kin, and we're going to work it out through thick and through thin. I lost a loved one. There's a hole in my heart. Now I'm taking you so that I have a new outlet for my love to help share that which exists in my heart once again. And so we did that ceremony that day. And it was very beautiful. It was another moment where you could see the impossible become possible. Because the bishop was there with his Roman collar and his robes, and big gold ring, gold chain. Sounds like I'm describing a rapper, but yeah, that's how the holy men on this other way of life, that's how they like to dress. It's cool. It's cool with me. I would get looked at funny if I showed up at a ceremony dressed like that, but so there we were, staring at another impossibility. The priest, his Roman collar on, being sung an honor song in one of our traditional roundhouses with a star blanket wrapped around his shoulders, doing the powwow two-step, holding the eagle feather up for each of the honor beats. All right? So I always say, reconciliation is not a second chance at assimilation. Because some people do look at it like that. It's like, yeah, that was terrible what happened to you guys back in the day, but can now we agree that you guys have to get with the program? No. I'm not interested in that. Right? There's a strength, there is a wisdom, and there is a beauty in Indigenous culture. Right? And we're not going to let that go. Right? That is what has sustained us. Right? That is what kept us going through the darkest hours. And here's news. Within that strength, within that wisdom, within that beauty, there is at least part of the solution to some of the great challenges of our time. Income inequality. How do you bring together people who are enemies fighting over the same homeland? The global war on terror, climate change, the environment, right? So we know that we've been damaged by colonialism because we bore the brunt of it. But you have all been damaged too. You've been damaged because for the past 150 years you've lived in a country that has been deprived of having Indigenous people, Indigenous culture, Indigenous nations contribute to our fullest potential. You think about what people like my father did, people like Phil Fontaine, people like Bobby Joe. Look what they did in spite of what they had to overcome as children. Imagine what they could have done had they been free to pursue their passions. They spent so much of their lives just getting to here, right? Imagine if they started from there. The interesting thing is there's still too many kids in this country still fighting to get to where they should be starting, right? And a disproportionate number of them are Indigenous, our First Nations, our Métis, our Inuit. Schools are underfunded. Child welfare agencies are underfunded. Those are the most vulnerable kids in our society, and we can't even give them a fair shake when they're in crisis and need to be taken from their families. The province that I live in, out of 10,000 kids in the child welfare system, 90% of them are Aboriginal. Missing and murdered women. Indigenous women are 4 times more likely to be murdered than non-Indigenous women. Why don't we act? Well, it's Indigenous men who are doing all of this, so it's an Indigenous problem. You know what? Domestic abuse, domestic violence is a huge problem in our community. And we need to stand up as men and redefine what it means to be the man. It's not about punching somebody out. It's not about having a big ego. It's not about running around. It's not about drinking a bunch of beers. No, man. Don't show me how many beers you can kill. Show me how many skulls you can pull at the Sundance. Don't show me how many people you can knock out. Show me how much money you can go and earn legally and then bring back to the res, bring back to the hood to help the little kids. Show me that. Then I'll see you as a man. That's a conversation that we need to have in our community. That's the change that we need to make. But guess what? The statistics that have been quoted to you by the federal government have been misrepresented. Because if you look at the RCMP report, which is the source of the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs' assertion that it's the problem of Indigenous men, what does that report really say? It says that the number is high, 70%. But the number is actually lower than what exists in the mainstream. Crucial piece of evidence which has not been shared with you in public. So while it is true that an Indigenous woman is likely to be murdered by an Indigenous man, it's also true that Indigenous women are less likely to be murdered by their spouses than other women in this country. That's not to say that things are better. No. It's just to say that it's not exclusively an Indigenous problem. We all have a role to play, and we have to do better to make sure that women of all walks of life are free of violence, free of harassment. So the title of the book that I tried to capture that journey with is The Reason You Walk. The Reason You Walk comes from one of our traditional songs. And in that traditional song it says, Ningosha and Nisha Wenje Pamoseyan, I am the reason you walk. As the song was explained to me by my late father and by Kwekwe Kibenas, Bill Skeed, one of the elders who instructed me, and his brother Kwekwe Gijik, Clifford Skeed, they told me, that is the Creator speaking to you. That is the Creator speaking to you. When you hear the song, the Creator is singing to you and telling you, I am the reason you walk. And as you go through your life, there will be 4 layers of meaning which will reveal themselves to you. When you're little, you will understand it as, I am the reason you walk, because I am what made you. And then you go further in your life and it will become, I am the reason you walk, in the sense that I animated you. I am life. And then you go further on that journey and it becomes, I am the reason you walk, in the sense that I am the universal embodiment of that thing called love, which drives you to make your life with other people and drives you further to make things right with them if things go wrong. And then finally, at the end of your life, you will understand that song to be telling you, I am the reason you walk. I am that thing at the end of your life that you are walking home towards. And so that was the teaching that they shared, and that was the one that I thought captured part of what my father was trying to show us here in his time here on earth. So I wrote the book that way because, initially the publishers came up to me and they're like, hey, Wab, you should write a book for us, okay? Why don't you write like The Inconvenient Indian, the Next Generation? Then they're like, you should write or maybe just write a memoir, right? It's like, well, it's a 33-year-old guy writing a memoir, like, I don't know, it's bad enough. Never mind like doing the other book idea, right, which was a 33-year-old guy waxing philosophical, right? That would have been a terrible book. But it's the same book. The thoughts on the Constitution, the thoughts on the politics, the thoughts on the cultural, social, economic issues are in there, but it's wrapped in the arc of one person's remarkable journey. Right? And I feel that that more accurately brings you into the experience, because I think one of the things that prevents us from achieving action on Indigenous issues in this country is the fact that people still see us as the other. And you can't tell me that doesn't exist, right? Honestly, that's part of why I like working in the States sometimes. Because when I go to Al Jazeera America, there's no Aboriginal program, right? Nobody looks at me and like, so, like, tell me what it was like to be on a reserve, you know? Like, hey, do you know Johnny such and such? He's native. Right? Like when I'm down there in the States, I'm just competing with everyone else, and I just am who I am. And there's a certain beauty in that. Right? So perhaps in understanding this story that has, you know, universal elements, reconciling yourself with a parent, taking care of a loved one as they approach the end, right? Perhaps we'll take a step closer to seeing each other as we really are. Because here's one of the things that we're starting to realize, that race does not exist, right? Race is a social construct. And I love the way Ta-Nehisi Coates writes about this. You know, he says that people think that race is the father of racism, but it's not. Race is the child of racism, right? Meaning that we have constructed race in our society to justify a social hierarchy. And nowhere is it more true in this country than as it applies to Indigenous people. Because for a long time, people have been trying to make us a race. First the red man, then the Indian race, then the First Nations race, and now the Aboriginal race. We're not a race. We are Indigenous nations. Right? So we have to shift that. We are people, just like you. Right? Maybe if we can make that change in mind, then we might be able to walk down this road together in a good way. Still being able to preserve that part of ourselves that we love and define in relation to community, but also in having freedom to inhabit whatever destiny we might choose for ourselves. You know? So that's what I hope people are able to draw out of the book, and the contribution that I hope it makes to our discourse in this country. And so with that, I'll say, Miigwech Kapizindawayek. Thank you guys very much for listening to me. And before I close, I'll sing that song that the title comes from. And this will be the fourth song. hey, 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 yo, hey, yeah, yeah, yeah. Ya 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 yo hey ya 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 yo hey yo hey yo hey yo hey yo hey oing.